We set the topic some time ago on this. It was probably just after the fires. Since then, we've had fire, certainly around where I live, we've had flood. We're now well into COVID. We've had the strange actions of China. And we've certainly had a significant event for national security only 2 weeks ago, on the 1st of this month, when the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister launched the 2020 Strategic Update and the Force Structure Plan. And they are extraordinary documents. I've been cynically looking at white papers for a long, long time. And since 1976, and I've had not much faith as a soldier in both of them, because I saw the fact that the words meant nothing, the resources rarely came, and in 3 years' time they changed their mind. At no stage, I make the statement, I've never been contradicted, at no stage has the Australian Defence Force ever been able to meet the stated or implied strategy in a defence white paper. So you might remember that I've been talking about this for a long, long time. I first started talking about it when I was in the military, probably 20 years ago. I started to see the difference between what we said we should be able to do and what we could in fact do, which reflected a total lack of strategy. I certainly discussed it in my first speech in the Senate, and those of you who are selectors in the Liberal Party, I certainly relied heavily on this during my last pre-selection. My greatest ally in getting acceptance of a national security strategy is the fires, which illustrated a lack of resilience, COVID, which illustrated a lack of self-reliance, and of course the actions of the Chinese Communist Party, who illustrate to every one of us that we should be very, very aware of what's going on in our region. And many Australians, and certainly many in the government, are seeing exactly that. Now, let me just for a minute take a bit of time to discuss what I'm talking about here. I use the term national sovereignty, which is the ability of a nation to act freely in its own interests. Just think about that for a while. National sovereignty is the ability of a nation to act freely in its own interests. And rarely is there a perfect sovereignty, rarely, if ever. So on some kind of scale, nations can choose how much sovereignty they are going to insist on. And that national sovereignty is fundamentally based on resilience. And resilience for a nation is based on self-reliance. And self-reliance is the base, resilience is the means, and sovereignty of a nation to act in its own interests is the objective. But resilience is critical. You can't prepare for every eventuality. You invariably will be impacted on by something which you didn't predict, and you must be able to react from that. You must be able to recover, to bounce back. You can lessen the risk, but rarely can you avoid all the risk. If you think back to the fires or you think back to COVID, we didn't predict either. We bounced back, we fought the fires back down, we brought in economic assistance to people, we rebuilt infrastructure, and we had a fairly good degree of resilience there. Of course, no one was cutting us off from foreign overseas aid. No one was causing damage in excess to our infrastructure. During COVID, of course, we were caught out even worse. And we discovered the fact that we lack self-reliance in various areas of, particularly of manufacture. A point to make is that self-reliance is not self-sufficiency. North Korea is self-sufficient. It doesn't need much from outside, and it does this on the basis that it impoverishes its people to an extraordinary degree. Russia, for example, has a smaller GDP than Australia, and that's an interesting point. Australia's GDP is larger than Russia, yet Russia has enormous armed forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, and it is a nuclear power. How do they do it? Well, they impoverish their people. The way you decide how much self-reliance, how much resilience, and how much sovereignty we as a nation want is done through a national security strategy. Many nations in the world have a national security strategy, a way of achieving national security, and they call it various things, but most nations in the world, particularly the big nations, call it a national security strategy. And it answers the question, what does a nation, not just a defence force, what does a nation have to do to be self-reliant, to be resilient and to be sovereign in an unfavourable strategic environment. And that's the key question. That's the key question that goes to national security. But there are much wider issues than just defence. I mentioned that we had a strategic update 2 weeks ago, and that was followed by a force structure plan for the Defence Force and $270 billion. Here we are in the middle of COVID with a national debt you can't jump over, yet the Prime Minister and the Expenditure Review Committee are prepared to pledge $270 billion over the next 10 years to the Defence Force, and that's extraordinary. The wider issue, though, is that for national security or national sovereignty, nothing is more important than the economy. And nothing is more important for us than getting the economy back. And that's what the Prime Minister is putting every effort into. But he was able to step outside because of our strategic environment changing and actually give time to defence and to national security. If you look at all the things that go to a national security strategy, as I said, the economy is the most important. Our diplomacy is fairly effective. We have allies. We have the Five Eyes arrangements, which are being used much more. We stand up for what we believe in. We are what they call the Quad, an arrangement we hope to have at some stage in the future between the US, Australia, Japan and India is critically important. And it's key to stay with the United States alliance. We cannot deter a war between the US and China. That's impossible for Australia. We cannot sustain an attack by a country as big as China on us. But what we can do, we can deter a direct attack on this country in the midst of a war between China and the United States. We don't want to be collateral damage to that. So the economy, diplomacy, governance. If we're going to achieve national security, if we're going to look after our self-reliance, our resilience and our sovereignty, we've got to be able to govern ourselves. And at the moment, I would suggest to you that with this government, we could run a serious war. We have a Prime Minister who shows the kind of leadership that you would expect in wartime. We have a bunch of ministers and bureaucrats now who have been tested through the fires and tested through COVID. They are extraordinarily experienced from my observation, and they know what to do. So we are very fortunate in that, and our governance from this government is doing well. Finance, if we're going through these areas of where we have to look at things for national security, we'd look at finance. Yeah, we've just borrowed a bunch more money in a defence emergency. As they say in peacetime, you've got all the time and no money. In wartime, you've got lots of money and no time. And that is so true. Cyber, we've just pledged $15 billion over the next 10 years for cyber to reinforce our cyber defences. 1.3 billion over the next year or so. Manufacturing is really the problem in national security. If you look at our liquid fuels, our pharmaceuticals, our fertiliser as examples, 90% of those three items come from overseas. Spare parts, IT, weapons, all come from overseas. Karen Andrews, the minister, the industry minister, is doing a great job, and she's done a great job in getting industries from almost nothing in Australia to support our COVID efforts and doing good things in relation to that. Of course, you go to health, you go to mining, food, water, infrastructure, energy, liquid fuels, and of course, the last one is defence. And the defence is the best I've seen it in the ADF. In the strategic, but still in the strategic environment at the moment, we lack lethality, sustainability and mass, which is what the update of strategy is trying to solve and what our plans are trying to achieve. Now, the reason that I'm talking about this now, and on this point I will finish and we'll open up for questions. The reason I'm talking about this now has two elements to it. The first element is that we've seen in the world the rise of four nations and an ideology. And I take that statement from the US National Security Strategy. They say that the greatest threat to Western liberal democracies is the rise of four nations, which are Iran, North Korea, China, and Russia. And the ideology, obviously, is Islamic extremism. But it's the second one of the two issues which I consider to be more important than the first, and that is the lessening of US power. The reason that we have not had to have a national security strategy to build self-reliance, resiliency and sovereignty from 1945 until now is really because we're allied with the single most powerful country that the world has ever seen. And I illustrate that by saying that the United States national security strategy at the end of the Cold War in 1991 had as its basis the fact that the US could win two major wars, perhaps a war in Europe and a war in the Middle East, two major wars and a small war, perhaps in South America, simultaneously. Think about that, simultaneously, two big wars and a small war. For that, they were prepared to put 2 million people into their military and fund it to the tune in today's dollars of $154 billion per year, just for the US military. The last national security strategy that the US has set has as its objective the ability to win one war and to hold in a second small war, to win one major war and hold in a second small war. To me, that represents about a 50% diminution of US military power. And that to me is very, very concerning. We could go through and question time, we might do that if people are interested in what that means in real terms in the number of ships, planes and troops that the US now has. We've come a long, long way since the 30 Years' War, when a third of the population of Europe died. We've come a long, long way since the French Revolution and the Napoleonic times, when roughly 7 million people died. In the First World War, 15 million people died. And in the Second World War, 60 to 80 million people died. The greatest achievement since 1945 is that we have avoided great power war. There's been any number of appalling wars, and I've been involved in a couple of them. There's been any number of appalling wars in that period of time, but we have not had major power war. If we could kill 60 to 80 million people in World War II and in industrial age war, imagine what we could do now. And the way to do it is to be resilient, is to be strong. We should welcome China's rise, but we should welcome it from a position of strength. We must be strong, because only if you're strong can you achieve deterrence, and to achieve deterrence, you must be able to win. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's very, very important now that we ask the question of ourselves, if the Prime Minister thinks that the Australian Defence Force needs $270 billion to carry it in and match the strategic environment over the next 10 years, the question I have is, what do we need to do in our society to match what the Prime Minister obviously thinks our Defence Force needs?